appreciate the chance to give these statements on our national sustainable mobility policy and to listen to deputies. I won't be here for the entire debate. There's a cabinet meeting at the same time, which is unfortunate, but I look forward to reading the record and hearing what other deputies have to say in how we use this moment in time to deliver a seismic change in the nature and the characteristics and the environmental aspects of our transport system. And I think key to this is going to be the switch to this new sustainable mobility mode. The National Sustainable Mobility Policy, published last month, sets out the approach that we need to take. I want to give some examples of what's happening, some of the structures we're going to need to put in place. But might start, first of all, with the imperative for us for doing this. And it's an imperative, I suppose, first and foremost, driven by our climate targets. We have to halve our emissions in this decade, and we expect transport to have to provide such an amount of reduction close to the average that we want to see across the economy. And that won't be easy. It'll be incredibly challenging because a lot of the patterns that have been put in place are ones that are in place because for several decades, 5 decades or more, we followed a transport policy which was about promoting private car use and which saw ever longer commuting distances, ever longer amount of time. I think the last census showing about 200,000 of our citizens commuting, just on the commuting side, for over an hour each way every day. And of those, about 80,000 having children under 15, about 45,000 having children in preschool years, so that they are hours, they are millions of hours when people are not spending time with their family, when there's huge frustration at the traffic gridlock that is caused by this system that has been created, not to mention the emissions that came from it. And what it also promoted was an ever-lengthening sprawl of particularly from our cities. If you looked at the census populations about distance travelled for work, you see this donut pattern around particularly each of our 5 cities, where people were moving out, commuting ever longer distances, and as I said, it didn't work in climate terms, it didn't work in the waste of time that people could otherwise have spent in a range of other much more preferable activities. And it was hugely expensive in terms of resources, in having to provide the infrastructure for it. So we now need to change and change everything. And there are 4 aspects, there are 4 legs to the stool that we will build a new transport system on. They are switching fuels, switching away from the use of fossil fuels, which we know we have to do, towards using electricity, biofuels, and hydrogen and other transport fuels which will meet our needs. We need to shift, we need to make a modal shift away from the over-dependence on the private car. I would say particularly maybe starting with our younger people, where there's been a remarkable change in the last 30 to 40 years, going from a country where the majority of young children, the vast majority, took the bus, walked or cycled to school, to the current environment where the vast majority are driven to school. Or indeed, in many cases, where there are more of our young people, take for example one of the statistics that jump out, there are more secondary school girls driving themselves to school than there are cycling to school or themselves to school. How did we create such an environment? We need to change it. We need that modal shift back, particularly in my mind, to active travel, walking, cycling and taking the bus and train. Thirdly, we need to shorten the overall amount of travel. We need to implement the national planning framework, which talks about not just decarbonising, but about supporting more compact development and better balanced regional development. So it's not everything built on the East Coast, ever-increasing growth in the numbers travelling in Dublin, and that's not just bad for the rest of the country. In the end, it's bad for Dublin because it won't be able to cope with the volume of traffic coming in and coming out of it. And lastly, in this switch, shift, shorten, the 4th S in sustainable mobility has to be towards sharing. In my mind, there's huge opportunity for us to develop sharing transport modes, recognising that most cars spend almost 92% of the day parked, not being used. and a sharing mode in this time of cost of living crisis is an obvious way in which we can reduce the economic burden from our householders while still providing the mobility they need without having to own necessarily every car, or being able to be flexible in terms of how they share mobility or share services to deliver that mobility. I want to give some examples of what's happening in government, what we're delivering on in 4 key aspects. Looking at particularly, first of all, active travel, because I think promoting it is the most important strategic development we seek to achieve. Looking at what's happening in bus transport, looking at how we do demand management to help us make this more sustainable shift, and lastly, just look at some of the governance structures that we're setting up in government to achieve this leap to having our climate emissions, reducing the amount of travel we have to do, seeing a shift and a switch in the fuels that we use. Firstly, with active travel. And it's very significant, just recent developments. There was a walking and cycling index published 2 weeks ago, where a very detailed survey was done of Irish householders, 71% of whom are citizens, were saying that they wanted to see more investment in cycling and walking infrastructure, greenways, cycle tracks, better footpaths. And that's behind, or one of the reasons why government has committed in our programme for government and in reality to provide over €360 million a year. Roughly, what we did was took the OECD recommendation that you spend 20% of the capital budget in transport on active travel, and that's what we're doing, following best international advice. And we're starting to see that pay dividends. It's only starting. But if you look at the Clontarf cycleway, which is being built at the moment, a new standard, a new level of priority for cyclists and pedestrians, as well as buses, which is what we need to do. If you look at McCurtain Street in Cork as an example of how that's a very busy city centre street can be changed. That's happening this year. O'Connell Street in Limerick, we need to do the same. Not just these streets, but just taking examples of projects that are starting to be delivered, starting to see happen. Las Concorda, the Salmon Weir Bridge in Galway, you know that there's, again, a terrible pinch point between the city and the university and the hospital. Incredibly narrow bridge where we're starting to provide new facilities, and it's only the start of what we need to do. Or in Waterford, taking the example of Waterford, that extension of the Greenway from Bilberry into the city, again an example of what's actually happening on the ground. It isn't just in our cities. There's some 1,200 walking and cycling projects being undertaken by local authorities right across the country. The likes of one I'm looking forward to as an example of this, a range of different projects. The new bridge in Athlone across the Shannon is part of that Greenway extending all the way from Dublin to Galway. But I think what that will do is it will transform Athlone, transform particularly the western side, that stunning, beautiful urban space on the western side of the Shannon in Athlone town, where that bridge can open it up, can provide huge rejuvenation, creating a public place as well as providing active travel infrastructure. The likes of the Hanover Residential and Cycling Scheme in Carlow, the likes of the N63 Cycling and Pedestrian Scheme in Longford. I could go on, but people will know around the country that we are starting, and we're only starting. We have a lot to learn in rolling out these projects, which are going to be critical in my mind as part of this transformative change in how we see walking and cycling in our city, and reverse this pattern that has developed in the last 40 years, where, as I said, in my time going to school, the majority walked, cycled or took the bus, to today where the vast majority are driven. We can turn that around. 170 schools now being the first of the Green Schools projects to improve the facilities, improve the infrastructure. But we need to go further. We need to really start, and I'll come back to this when I look at the final section in terms of governance, in my mind, at this critical point in time as we come out of the COVID period, that when patterns are still flexible, still changing, that we actually are going to now need to actually go further to provide a safer space right across this country to make our villages, our towns, our countryside and our cities safe and accessible and pleasurable places to walk and cycle. And the benefits from that are not just in climate. They're in a much more efficient transport system. They're in a much healthier population. The health benefits from active travel are beyond compare. And lastly, I'd say in terms of the benefits in this, it's also a social justice project. Because the large number of houses in my own Dublin city, I always remember when I was a councillor in Dublin city, almost half the households didn't own a car. A lot of them couldn't afford a car. A lot of them suffered the worst pollution, noise pollution, air pollution, congestion problems from a traffic system that didn't serve them. We weren't providing for those households that didn't have a car. What were we doing? Well, now we are. And it's a more economic, it's a healthier, it's a cleaner, it's a safer and a much better system. It isn't just active travel. We also need to do the same in bus infrastructure, and we're doing that. Only last week, the third of the Bus Connects routes in Dublin being launched, going to onboard Penala. Routes start to be put in on the Howth and the Lucan and other lines where we're starting to reform the whole route network as well as the street formation to give further priority to buses. And it's not just in Dublin. Only last month in Cork, the Sustainable Transport Corridors report was published by the NTA and Cork cities and county councils. And that's going to go back now to public consultation in the coming months. I think there's 12 corridors being planned in Cork. And it's this combination of cycling and walking. In Cork, some 54 new kilometres of walking cycling routes, some 75 kilometres of new bus routes. Same in Galway. It's critical that in Galway we develop these high-quality bus corridors with the prospect, Glasgow, as I'm sure you'd be welcome, to actually shape the city around public transport, not on roads. And in that then look at the retrofitting of those bus corridors with light rail. That's the step change that I think we can make, but it starts with giving high-quality priority to bus in Galway, in Limerick and in Waterford, as well as in Cork and Dublin. And it's happening, and it needs to be accelerated, which, as I said, I'm going to go back to in my closing comments regarding the governance system. Those Bus Connects networks in our cities are important, but if I was to say what is probably the most important bus project we have before us, it's the Connecting Ireland bus project, where we're looking at establishing new rural bus transport routes. There's about 100 towns and villages. If we deliver on this scheme, which will see for the first time frequent public transport bus services, proper public transport services. We started last year with some experimental schemes in Dingle, in Leitrim, and now we're expanding it out. We're starting to expand it out first for the Ukrainian people who come into our country to make sure that they have access to public transport services, and the likes of North Clare. But this is a 5-year project. And each year rolling out new services, new clever loop services, so that they connect to other train stations, connect to other transport infrastructure, so that you start to get that synergy that every part of the country starts to see public transport as part of their transport system. And I think that project is going to be key. And we have to deliver it in a time of change, as I said, in a time when the patterns that were in place before COVID are unlikely to return. So that will require us to start looking at, do we have all the buses in the right location? Do we need all the level of commuting services that were had previously? Or do we need to match new transport patterns that will come with people working from home remotely? The need of new town services, which we've introduced recently in Kilkenny and Athlone and elsewhere. That's the sort of review of our public transport systems needs to be done to help adjust to the changing patterns coming out of COVID. One of the other things the government had done in bus system is to put in that 20% reduction in transport fares to the end of the year, all public transport fares, as a way of encouraging people back on public transport coming out of COVID. And for younger people, a 50% reduction in fares to make sure that that pattern is set early in life when you're under 24. And we're going to have to continue to review and monitor and measure, as I said, how the public transport system is being used in this new post-COVID, heading towards decarbonised world, to make sure that it fits the changing patterns of transport, which are changing radically from what was there prior to this. The third of the three aspects, so it's active travel, it's bus travel, it is also thirdly demand management. All those public transport fares will help us, as I said, switch away from private car ownership. And it's not that the private car owner is the wrong or bad person, but it's just it mathematically doesn't work. It's very expensive. It creates congestion that ends up costing everyone, as well as having high emissions. So as well as these lower fares, what we're looking at is the 5 cities demand management strategy, again published earlier this year. And that is going to be a critical part of the changes we need to make. We need to reallocate space to support these more sustainable transport solutions. We need to look at our car parking patterns to see, are they promoting sustainable urban and rural design systems? Or do we need to regulate some of those car parking systems so the space possibly could be used to create better local environment, to create better streetscapes, to support retailers in ways other than the kind of option of everyone driving to every shop front and then driving off and leaving our streets less attractive, less safe, less efficient, less effective as an urban public realm. Lastly, I mentioned governance. We have the right plans in place, in my mind, to deliver this switch. We have the National Development Plan with €35 billion committed to transport in this next 8 years. We have the Climate Action Plan, again very strong and very legally effective in terms of steering us in the direction of a more sustainable low-carbon system. We have the National Planning Framework, and we have our National Sustainable Mobility Policy. What we now need to do, what this government is committed to doing in the remaining 2 3/4 years in office, is to focus on the delivery, on making sure we bring real, efficient, effective, quick change, because we have to be fast here before transport patterns are set once again coming as we come out of the COVID period. And also critically in these next 3 years, up to 2025, that we meet our carbon budget for 2025, which in transport is probably going to be one of the most difficult things to do. So therefore, we have established in government a leadership group and a delivery team beneath it, involving various government departments, involving agencies like the NTA, like TII, bringing in outside expertise and bringing in new thinking and sharing it to our national climate dialogue so that stakeholders across the country can recommend ideas, see what's happening, understand what is in the programme. That leadership group and those leadership groups also include the regional authorities and the city and county management associations. And critically, what we're going to do now is go around the country to each local authority and say, can you put forward some Pathfinder projects, we're calling them, where projects that we can deliver in these next 3 years might be done super fast. Using the example that Robert Burns in Dunleary showed in terms of some of the coastal cycle routes, where you use actually very low-cost solutions, where you work with communities so that you get agreement on what is very difficult. We all know this, space reallocation to support cycling, walking, or bus transport is not easy. But that is what we have to do. If we don't use this opportunity, the space that was previously used for mass commuting, which is not going to return, then we'll have missed this. We'll have failed in the next 3 years in meeting our climate targets and in switching the whole country towards a more sustainable direction. So what I hope in each city and each county, the managers and the councils, it has to come from bottom up, it can't be directed from top down, it has to be wanted, be that in Limerick. The likes of the sort of type of project we might look at is the 3 universities joining up together with a bus and cycle and walking network, which would transform the city centre, which would bring life back into the centre, which would connect the colleges, which could be done relatively low cost. Or reopening the Foynes line. I think you were speaking to Tánaiste in the Dáil there last week and suggesting that could be done quickly as a way of switching away from everyone driving to the industrial estate, getting stuck, not working system, towards an instead fast-tracking the rail solution there to be able to serve our industrial sites better, provide access to Adair for the Ryder in time for the Ryder Cup. It's those sort of accelerated projects is what we want to seek to deliver now. And it could go through every Galway city. What should we do in the next 3 years in Galway City to turn it? I hate to say it, Las Concord, I've said it previously, we've discussed it. It's probably the least effective transport system in terms of the 5 cities we have. What could we do in 3 years, or what targets would we set ourselves? I went to Galway the week before last, and said to the local authority and said to the local Chamber of Commerce, will you come back with your proposal of the bus connects and cycling and greenway projects that we could deliver for the next 3 years?
I'd be accused of not being fair if I let you go on, Minister.
I'll finish on this then. I'll finish on this. What we want is the councils in the country to come to this leadership group with proposals for these Pathfinder projects that we could deliver at low cost and high speed as part of this sustainable mobility revolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister.